Imagine standing in Constantinople in the year 541 AD, a city of marble and miracles, golden domes glinting under the sun, markets overflowing with silks, spices, incense, and voices speaking a dozen languages at once. An empire at its peak, glorious, confident, unshakable. But beneath this brilliance, something moves unseen, something small, something lethal. An enemy no wall could stop, no army could fight, no emperor could command. This is the Plague of Justinian. A city on the edge, at the height of Emperor Justinian's reign, when he dreamed of rebuilding the Roman world, ships began arriving from Egypt, carrying grain to feed the capital. But hidden in the dark holds were rats. And on those rats were fleas. And inside those fleas waited Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that would later unleash the Black Death centuries later. No one saw it coming. At first, it was just a whisper. A merchant collapsing in the bustling market. A dock worker found fevered and delirious near the harbor. A young girl developing a strange swelling called a bubo under her arm. Then the whisper became a storm. The city falls. Silent contemporary accounts describe a nightmarish scene. The streets of Constantinople filled with wagons piled high with corpses. Church bells rang non-stop, not for celebration, but for death. The air was thick with smoke, incense, and the metallic stench of decay. The historian Procopius wrote that the dead lay stacked like columns of marble, thousands per day, entire families gone within hours. Grave diggers abandoned their tools from sheer exhaustion and fear. Priests collapsed during prayer. Even the mighty Theodosian walls, which had protected the city from sieges for centuries, could not keep the plague out. At its peak, estimates say the plague killed nearly 10,000 people a day in Constantinople alone. Emperor Justinian himself fell ill. Fever, delirium, the telltale swelling. For days, the empire held its breath as its ruler teetered on the edge of death. He recovered, but he was never quite the same. More importantly, the empire would never be the same. A world unmade. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed momentum. It killed dreams. Justinian's armies, poised to reclaim the lost Western Roman territories, suddenly found themselves with no soldiers to fight. Trade routes crumbled, provinces emptied, fields lay untilled beneath the sun. Economies imploded, and social order frayed. Some historians estimate that half of the Mediterranean world's population perished. Entire cities disappeared from maps. Cultural and economic setbacks endured for decades. Economist and historian William McNeill argued that the Plague of Justinian was the first great pandemic in recorded Western history, reshaping political and economic power for centuries to come. Some scholars suggest this pandemic marked the beginning of centuries-long decline for the Byzantine Empire, its military weakened, its borders vulnerable, its place in the ancient world forever changed. A warning from the past. The Plague of Justinian reminds us of a truth as old as human civilization itself. Humanity's greatest threats are often invisible, silent, patient, waiting. From the ancient grapevine to the bustling metropolis of today, diseases have shaped nations, inspired revolutions, and redefined human destinies. This was only the first great pandemic to reshape our world. Next came the most infamous of them all, the Black Death, a pandemic that would turn medieval Europe into a vast graveyard and rewrite the very structure of society. Imagine Europe in the early 14th century. A world of soaring cathedrals, crowded marketplaces, and narrow cobblestone streets winding between wooden houses. Church bells echoed through every valley. Caravans moved along ancient trade routes. Ships sailed the Mediterranean carrying wool, grain, spices, and soon, something far more dangerous. Life was fragile but predictable, shaped by harvests, faith, and the rhythm of the seasons. No one knew this fragile balance was about to shatter. From the vast steppes of Central Asia, a silent killer awoke. Merchants traveling the Silk Road carried more than silk and porcelain. They carried rats. And those rats carried fleas infected with Yersinia pestis, the dreaded bacterium behind bubonic plague. By 1346, the plague arrived at the Crimean port of Kaffa. Here, a chilling tale emerged. Besieging Mongol armies, struck by the plague, flung infected corpses over city walls in one of history's earliest reports of biological warfare. In terror, survivors fled by sea, unwitting carriers of death. Ships docked in Mediterranean ports, Constantinople, Messina, Genoa, Marseille. Unloading crews and dock workers fell ill within days. Entire port cities fell silent within weeks. The Black Death had landed. From coastal ports, the plague disseminated inexorably across Europe, along rivers, pilgrim routes, wagon roads, and trade highways that crisscrossed the continent. No settlement was spared, not kingdoms, villages, nor monasteries. In thriving cities like Florence and Paris, corpses crowded streets and filled markets faster than grave diggers could bury them. The air reeked of burning incense, desperation, and death's decay. Contemporary chroniclers were aghast. Neighbors locked away, fleeing from one another. Families perished behind bolted doors. Priests abandoned sacred spaces, powerless against the unseen scourge. Dogs and cats were slaughtered in panic, crippling natural rat control and worsening the plague's spread. Giovanni Boccaccio, in his famed Decameron, portrayed a world where fathers fled their own children, and the dead were buried by nightfall, cold and anonymous. In many towns, up to 70% of the population vanished. Some villages were extinguished entirely. Mass graves grew, vast pits swallowing hundreds of bodies at once, silent monuments to a vanished world. By 1352, as the plague loosened its deadly grip, Europe had suffered a demographic cataclysm. Half the population lay dead. But the Black Death did more than take lives. It shattered the medieval world. The rigid structures of feudalism began to crumble. Landowners who once easily replaced dues-paying peasants found workers in short supply. Survivors realized their new power, demanding wages, freedom, and mobility. This seismic shift laid the groundwork for the decline of serfdom, the rise of wage labor, and the slow birth of capitalism. Artists expressed the grim reality through haunting Dance of Death murals, reminding all that death leveled kings and peasants alike. Doctors armed with rudimentary tools and little understanding of germs struggled helplessly. The church's moral authority eroded, unable to shield the faithful from plague and despair. In its wake rose mystics, apocalyptic sects, and desperate quests for meaning. Psychological scars endured for generations. Scapegoats were hunted. Jews and minorities faced horrific persecution. Suspicion and fear stained the social fabric. Europe learned that the world could end abruptly, not with thunderous war, but with silent death. Yet from this darkness blossomed profound transformation, new ideas, freedom, opportunity. The Black Death paved the road to the Renaissance. Imagine a world untouched by European disease, a world where vast empires rose not behind stone castles, but in jungles, mountains, and endless plains, where marketplaces bustled in Tenochtitlan, a city larger, cleaner, and more sophisticated than any in Europe, where Andean farmers carved kingdoms from mountainsides, where millions thrived in vibrant civilizations, the Aztec, the Maya, the Inca, isolated for centuries. For thousands of years, these peoples knew no smallpox, no measles, no influenza, no plague. Their immune systems had never faced such enemies, no resistance, no memory of past pandemics, no natural defenses. And then, the ships arrived. At first, they brought curiosity, exchange, negotiation. Then came something far more devastating. A microscopic invader carried in the breath, skin, and blood of European sailors and soldiers. Smallpox, the deadliest virus in human history. It began quietly. In 1518, a single infected sailor disembarked in the Caribbean. A cough, a fever, a rash. Indigenous communities, unaware, nursed him with compassion. But before the first blister even appeared, the virus spread. Days later, entire villages collapsed. When Hernán Cortés marched inland toward Tenochtitlan in 1519, smallpox preceded him like a silent army. The virus spread faster than conquistadors could travel. Aztec chronicles describe people covered in pustules, unable to move or eat, crying out in agony. Families died behind locked doors. Whole neighborhoods fell still. The Aztec Emperor Cuitlahuac himself died of smallpox. Leadership crumbled, social order evaporated. Smallpox achieved what no European army could. The fall of the Aztec Empire began not with steel, but with a virus. Far to the south, the Inca Empire faced the same fate. Smallpox raced along the royal road system long before Europeans reached the Andean highlands. Villages emptied, priests died, leaders vanished overnight. The Inca Emperor Huayna Capac died of smallpox in 1525. His death ignited a civil war that fractured the empire just as Spanish forces arrived. Smallpox softened the land before European boots ever touched the soil. From the Caribbean to Mexico, and from the Andes to the Great Plains, the devastation was unimaginable. Smallpox killed millions. Some estimates suggest up to 90% of the indigenous population perished, the most lethal pandemic in human history. Survivors described ghostly landscapes, abandoned fields, silent temples, empty roads, communities too weak to bury their dead, children wandering alone. Chroniclers wrote that the world turned upside down. Yet amid the ruins, resilience endured. Indigenous peoples fought to preserve culture, language, and tradition despite staggering loss. They rebuilt, adapted, and resisted. Stories too often lost, but essential to human survival. This encounter between Europe and the Americas remains one of history's greatest tragedies, where biology, geography, and fate collided to reshape continents. But the story of smallpox did not end there. For centuries, the virus spread worldwide, across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the New World. It scarred generations, toppled rulers, and sparked revolutions in medicine. In 1796, Edward Jenner's breakthrough vaccine would begin the fight to eradicate smallpox, a victory achieved only in 1980. But before that victory came another catastrophe, the Spanish flu. The fall of civilizations in the Americas did not end with the Aztec and the Inca. Far to the north, across the vast plains, forests, and river valleys of North America, other nations thrived for centuries. Powerful, organized, sophisticated societies with their own cities, alliances, and empires. And just like in the South, they too would meet their greatest enemy long before they met European armies. Imagine the continent before colonization. Great bison herds thunder across the plains. Mississippian cities rise along the rivers, vibrant hubs of trade, art, and diplomacy. Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, stands as the largest city north of Mexico. Massive earthen pyramids reaching toward the sky, plazas filled with tens of thousands of people. A world full of life, movement, and culture. But this world was far more fragile than it appeared. When smallpox swept through the Caribbean and Mexico, the virus did not stop at borders or mountains. It traveled with traders, captives, and refugees. It moved ahead of European expansion like a ghost. And then, somewhere between the late 1500s and early 1600s, the great cities of the Mississippi fell silent. Archaeologists find evidence of sudden abandonment, empty plazas, unfinished buildings, fields left untended. Whole societies vanished without a recorded battle. Most likely, a wave of epidemics, smallpox, measles, influenza, swept through populations that had never faced such diseases. A century before settlers reached the interior of North America, millions were already gone. But the tragedy didn't end there. As European colonies pushed westward, diseases spread faster than any expedition. In the early 18th century, smallpox erupted across the Great Plains. It struck the Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara, powerful trading nations who controlled river routes and buffalo territories. Historian accounts describe warriors covered in pustules, villages burned to stop the spread, families collapsing together in earth lodges. Yet the deadliest blow came in 1837. A steamboat, the St. Peter, traveled up the Missouri River carrying infected passengers. Though the crew tried to hide the outbreak, the virus reached Fort Clark, a Mandan settlement. Within weeks, nearly the entire nation was gone. Elders, warriors, children, whole clans lost. Survivors describe bodies stacked in circles around their lodges, as if entire families had died mid-conversation. Mandan chiefs called it the day the world ended. Only a few dozen remained from a nation of thousands. This epidemic unleashed a chain reaction across the plains. Smallpox tore through the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Cree, the Crow, the Sioux. Nomadic cultures that once commanded enormous territories suddenly faced demographic collapse. Hunting grounds changed hands. Power shifted. Wars ignited as surviving tribes tried to protect or reclaim weakened lands. Disease reshaped the political map long before the United States did. But it wasn't only smallpox. Measles, influenza, scarlet fever, each wave carved another wound. Some epidemics began with heartbreaking innocence, a friendly handshake at a trading post, a child accepting a blanket, a missionary sharing food. But behind every gesture lay microbes no one could see. The historian Alfred Crosby called these events virgin soil epidemics, outbreaks that strike populations with zero biological memory of the disease. Few moments in human history demonstrate their horror more clearly than what happened in 1780-1782, when smallpox swept from Mexico into the American Southwest. It reached the Comanche, the most formidable horse empire the continent had ever seen. Warriors unmatched in speed, skill, and strategy. Smallpox killed them faster than any enemy ever could. Entire rancherias fell silent. For a moment, even the lords of the plains were powerless. These epidemics did more than kill. They changed history itself. They weakened nations before wars even began. They reshaped alliances. They softened resistance. They paved the way for colonial expansion, railroads, land seizures, and treaties signed under desperation. And yet, through it all, many indigenous nations survived. Their stories endured through oral tradition, art, ceremony, and resistance. They rebuilt again and again, adapting to loss on a scale unimaginable. But the scars remain, invisible to most, but deeply etched into the memory of the continent. The fall of the New World was not a single moment. It was a centuries-long storm of epidemics, waves of devastation that swept from the Caribbean to the Arctic, long before most Europeans ever arrived. This is the hidden chapter of American history, a chapter where disease, more than conquest, changed everything. Imagine a world at war. The year is 1918. Across Europe, artillery roars day and night. Soldiers huddle in muddy trenches, choking on gas fumes, mud, and fear. Trains filled with recruits cross vast landscapes. Steamships bring troops from every corner of the world: India, Canada, Australia, Africa, America. The First World War is still raging. Empires are collapsing. Nations bleed. And into this chaos comes an enemy unlike anything humanity has ever faced. Invisible, silent, faster than any army. The influenza virus, the Spanish flu. It began quietly in a military camp in Kansas in early 1918. A cook fell ill, fever, chills, fatigue. By noon, over 100 soldiers were sick. Within days, the virus consumed the entire base. Troops shipped overseas unknowingly carried the virus across the Atlantic. The war should have slowed the spread, but instead, the virus mutated, becoming deadlier, unstoppable. European battlefields became killing grounds beyond bullets and bombs. Soldiers survived artillery and gas attacks, only to be felled by a relentless cough. Victims drowned in their own lungs, bodies turning blue from oxygen deprivation. Doctors named it the Purple Death. Unlike traditional flu, this strain targeted the strong, men and women aged 20 to 40, the very backbone of societies and armies. Hospitals overflowed. Barracks turned into mass sick wards. Doctors, desperate and under-equipped, administered aspirin, whiskey, and hope. The wartime governments silenced the truth. Newspapers in Britain, France, Germany hid the severity, fearing panic and loss of morale. Only neutral Spain reported openly on the outbreak, giving the pandemic its misleading name. With the end of the war, jubilant crowds packed cities, unwitting breeding grounds for a second deadlier wave. This mutated virus swept through populations with terrifying speed. Healthy people went to bed and died by morning, Body piles grew in tenements, mass graves dug by bulldozers. Whole families disappeared overnight. The scale was unprecedented. No coffins left in some towns. Horses hauling carts stacked high with bodies, reminiscent of medieval plagues. The virus circled the globe within a year, from India, where it killed over 12 million, to remote Inuit villages in Alaska and sprawling cities of Europe, Asia, and Africa. By 1920, the death toll reached between 50 and 100 million, surpassing all deaths in World War I combined. The Spanish flu revolutionized public health forever. Governments established disease reporting and quarantine systems. Medical science accelerated research into viruses, immunity, and epidemiology. Wearing masks became widespread. Hospitals designed isolation wards. Cities learned the hard lesson: early action saves lives. Yet, after this devastation, the world soon forgot. Overshadowed by war and roaring 1920s optimism, the greatest medical disaster of the modern age faded from public memory. But it left an indelible mark. Invisible enemies can return at any time. The Spanish flu was not the first, nor the last. As history shows, diseases have shaped wars, empires, and revolutions. Now, as the 20th century marched onward, science marched with it, armed with vaccines, antibiotics, and public health systems. A revolution was coming, a revolution that would redefine humanity's battle against disease. This story leads us into the next chapter of medical breakthroughs, brilliant minds, and the global fight for survival. World War II is remembered for tanks, planes, and battles that reshaped the world. But beneath the gunfire and rubble, another war raged. A war fought by microbes. Wherever armies marched, disease followed. Silent, invisible, unstoppable. The first battleground was the ghettos and camps of Nazi-occupied Europe. Millions of people were forced into overcrowded, starving, freezing spaces. Typhus, carried by lice, spread through these conditions with terrifying speed. In the Warsaw Ghetto, doctors created underground clinics and illegal vaccination networks, risking their lives simply to slow the outbreak. They documented every detail in secret, hoping the world would one day learn from their suffering. In the concentration camps, typhus became more than a disease. It became a death sentence. Prisoners showing symptoms were sent directly to extermination. Nazi disease control meant killing the sick. Yet even in this horror, science emerged. Imprisoned doctors studied typhus using stolen equipment and scraps of paper. Their observations would later help scientists understand the bacteria behind the disease, knowledge born in darkness. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, another plague shaped the war: malaria. In the jungles of the Pacific, it killed more soldiers than bullets or bombs. Entire battalions collapsed with fever. Some Japanese units saw infection rates above 80%. American and Australian troops fought two enemies at once: the Imperial Army and the mosquito. Commanders created anti-malaria squads, draining swamps, burning brush, distributing quinine and atabarine tablets. Campaigns in New Guinea slowed, stalled, even failed because of malaria. Victory and defeat often depended on who stayed healthy long enough to fight. But the darkest chapter of wartime disease unfolded in East Asia. In occupied China, the secret Japanese program known as Unit 731 carried out some of the most horrific biological experiments in history. Behind barbed wire near Harbin, scientists infected prisoners with plague, cholera, and anthrax. Vivisections were performed without anesthesia. Millions of plague-infected fleas were bred for weapon use. Then came real attacks. Japanese aircraft dropped ceramic bombs filled with plague-carrying fleas onto Chinese towns. Wells were poisoned with cholera. Villages vanished within days. After the war, many Unit 731 scientists were granted immunity by the United States in exchange for their research data. The horrors remained hidden for decades. And when the fighting finally ended in 1945, disease did not stop. A new epidemic rose from the ruins. Tuberculosis, destroyed cities, starving refugees, and shattered hospitals created perfect breeding grounds. Millions were infected across Europe. thousands died every week. Only in 1946, with the discovery of streptomycin, the first true antibiotic against TB, did the tide begin to turn. For many, it was the first time hope outweighed fear. World War II redrew borders and reshaped nations. But beneath the political story lies a biological one. Typhus in the ghettos, malaria in the Pacific, plague and cholera unleashed by Unit 731, tuberculosis sweeping the post-war world. War magnifies disease. It breaks sanitation, collapses hospitals, and weakens every defense the human body has. Behind every battlefield, there is another front line, the invisible one inside the human bloodstream. And as the world rebuilt from ashes, humanity faced a new challenge. Could we finally learn to prevent these invisible catastrophes before they began? The answer would come in the decades that followed, through science, cooperation, and the greatest public health campaigns ever attempted. Across the long arc of history, disease has been as decisive as kings, generals, and revolutions. Some pandemics are famous: the Plague of Justinian, the Black Death, the Spanish flu. But countless others swept silently across continents, altering wars, collapsing nations, and reshaping civilizations in ways we rarely acknowledge. Their footprints lie beneath the surface of history, subtle yet immense. Consider yellow fever. In the 18th and 19th centuries, this mosquito-borne killer wielded power behind the scenes. In 1802, Napoleon dispatched tens of thousands of soldiers to Haiti to crush a fierce slave uprising and restore his empire's grip. But the soldiers never encountered their enemy on the battlefield. Instead, mosquitoes carried yellow fever through the camps, ravaging the French forces. 40,000 died in months. Napoleon abandoned his Caribbean ambitions and, not long after, sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States, doubling a young nation's size. A microscopic assassin had redrawn the world map. Cholera carved its legacy of terror through 19th century cities. From India, it ripped across Europe and the Americas in fierce waves. Rivers, markets, and crowded streets paralyzed by fear. Unaware that contaminated water bore the disease, families fled in all directions. In London, a young physician, John Snow, traced a deadly outbreak to a single water pump on Broad Street. By removing its handle, Snow launched epidemiology, turning mystery into method, fear into understanding. Typhus, the dreaded war fever, stalked armies and ravaged camps for centuries. During Napoleon's ill-fated 1812 Russian campaign, typhus ravaged more soldiers than sword or frostbite. The Grand Army crumbled not beneath Russian fire, but microbial attack. The dream of a French-led Europe shattered by unseen enemies. Smallpox, too, left scars far from the Americas. For centuries, it surged across Asia, Africa, and Europe. Kings and queens succumbed, dynasties wavered. Catherine the Great nearly died of smallpox. Yet she later championed mass vaccinations that saved millions and pioneered state-sponsored health. Measles, often dismissed today as a minor childhood illness, once struck with terrifying force. In the late 19th century, it swept through the Pacific Islands, killing entire villages in weeks. On Fiji alone in 1875, measles claimed 1/3 of the population. A lone passenger ship had introduced it, a sobering reminder of how fragile isolated societies can be. And finally, the modern era's silent killer, HIV/AIDS. Emerging in the late 20th century, it spread quietly but inexorably. Misunderstood and stigmatized, it devastated communities globally. Governments delayed responses while millions perished. But from tragedy arose activism, breakthroughs in medicine, and a new global solidarity. HIV reshaped not only public health, but culture, politics, and human rights. These epidemics were not just agents of death. They steered the outcomes of wars and empires, forced societies to confront deep fears, injustices, and vulnerabilities, propelled science forward against staggering odds. History may remember kings and generals, but behind so many turning points lurks a quieter force, microbial. And as science advanced, humanity learned. If disease shapes history, then our knowledge could shape the future. A new chapter beckoned, one of discovery, resilience, and hope. For thousands of years, cities represented human progress, places of trade, innovation, and opportunity. But they also became something much darker, perfect engines of disease. Wherever people crowded together, microbes thrived. And in the world's largest cities, epidemics hit with devastating force. Imagine London in 1665, a maze of timber houses leaning into narrow streets, markets packed shoulder to shoulder, and open sewers running through the alleys. Rats scurried through every corner of the city, carrying fleas that carried death. The plague began quietly, inside a small house in the parish of St. Giles. A tailor's assistant fell ill. His family hoped the sickness would pass, but neighbors heard the muffled cries behind the shutters. Soon, a red cross was painted on their door with the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Plague carts rolled through the nighttime streets, lit only by a lonely lantern. Drivers called out, "Bring out your dead," while terrified families pushed wrapped bodies toward the cart, praying the next victim would not be someone still alive inside their home. Within months, the city was paralyzed. Church bells tolled relentlessly. Grass grew between the cobblestones. Shops remained shuttered as silence replaced London's usual roar. A quarter of the city's population died. Then came an unexpected twist: the Great Fire of London in 1666. It destroyed thousands of homes, including the cramped, rat-infested buildings where the plague thrived. It was a tragedy, but it also helped bring the epidemic to an end. In a single sweep of flames, London was forced to rebuild itself cleaner and healthier than before. 2 centuries later, the Industrial Revolution gave rise to a new kind of city, darker, louder, and even more crowded. Factories roared day and night. Tenements rose brick by brick, packing entire families into a single room. Fresh air was a luxury. Privacy was non-existent. And into this environment crept tuberculosis, the White Plague. TB spread through coughing, and in these suffocating apartments, it moved effortlessly from person to person. Young laborers collapsed at their machines. Children wasted away in dark rooms with no sunlight. Writers described the illness as a mysterious, almost poetic affliction, but there was nothing poetic about it. It was poverty made visible. Families sent their sick to mountain sanatoriums for fresh air treatments. But true cures wouldn't arrive until antibiotics were developed decades later. For more than a century, tuberculosis shaped, and often shortened, the lives of millions in the world's most rapidly growing urban centers. Across the ocean, New York became the great gateway of the Western Hemisphere. Immigrants arrived by the millions, full of hope. But before they entered the city, they faced medical inspection at Ellis Island. Doctors scanned each face in seconds, looking for signs of trachoma, tuberculosis, or fever. One physician later wrote, "In a single glance, we judged a life." One infected passenger could set off an epidemic in the overcrowded tenements of Manhattan's Lower East Side. In those narrow rooms, several families often shared a single space. Air barely moved. Heat was suffocating. Disease spread from floor to floor like sparks leaping between dry wooden beams. New York grew into a metropolis, but epidemics forced it to modernize. Sanitation departments, building codes, waste systems, and the foundations of the American public health system were born out of necessity and crisis. Meanwhile, in 1894, one of the world's most important epidemics erupted in Hong Kong. A bustling port, packed with wooden houses stacked along steep hills, became the epicenter of a terrifying plague outbreak. People died so quickly that bodies were carried out in baskets. Streets emptied. Panic spread faster than the disease itself. And in the middle of this chaos, 2 scientists, Alexander Yersin and Kitasato Shibasaburo, worked in makeshift laboratories, desperately trying to identify the cause. They studied tissue samples late into the night, surrounded by fear and uncertainty. Then came the breakthrough. They discovered the tiny bacterium responsible for centuries of devastation, the organism later named Yersinia pestis. For the first time in human history, the deadliest plague known to civilization finally had a face. From the terror of Hong Kong, modern microbiology was born. Urban epidemics reshaped the world. They forced governments to build sewage systems, quarantine stations, water treatments, and organized health departments. They changed architecture, infrastructure, and the way cities were designed. They turned disease control into a public responsibility. The plague transformed London, cholera transformed Paris, tuberculosis transformed the industrial world, outbreaks transformed New York, and Hong Kong's tragedy transformed global science. Cities built civilization, but they also taught us that where humans gather, microbes gather too. And the fight against disease is always fought first in the streets, homes, and crowded alleys of urban life. And now, the story continues with how humanity finally pushed back with vaccines, antibiotics, and the first global campaigns to defeat disease. Across the long arc of history, disease has been as decisive as kings, generals, and revolutions. Some pandemics are notorious: the Plague of Justinian, the Black Death, the Spanish flu. But countless others have swept silently through continents, altering the course of wars, dismantling empires, and rewriting civilizations in ways we seldom fully acknowledge. Their traces are buried deep beneath the surface of history, subtle yet monumental. Take yellow fever. In the 18th and 19th centuries, this mosquito-borne assassin determined the fate of mighty empires. In 1802, Napoleon sent tens of thousands of soldiers to Haiti, aiming to crush a slave uprising and restore colonial control. But the enemy was invisible. Mosquitoes carried yellow fever with relentless precision. Over 40,000 French troops died in just months. Napoleon abandoned his Caribbean ambitions and soon after sold the Louisiana Territory to the burgeoning United States, doubling its size overnight. A tiny virus had redrawn the world map. Then there was cholera. It swept through India and spread across Europe and the Americas in violent waves during the 19th century. Cities were paralyzed with fear. Families fled in all directions. The enemy was water contaminated with Vibrio cholerae, but few understood its true nature. It was a brutal teacher. A doctor named John Snow traced a deadly outbreak in London to a single water pump. By removing its handle, he laid the foundations of modern epidemiology, transforming mystery into method. And there was typhus, the war fever, favoring filth, famine, chaos. It stalked armies and camps for centuries. During Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812, typhus and dysentery killed more soldiers than bullets or frostbite. It shattered the illusion of invincibility, demonstrating that tiny microbes could break empires and dreams alike. Meanwhile, smallpox' terrifying legacy stretched across Asia, Africa, and Europe. It scarred kings, killed queens, and shattered royal dynasties. Catherine the Great nearly succumbed to it, then pioneered mass vaccination programs that saved millions and set a precedent for modern public health. Measles, once dismissed as a minor childhood disease, was once a ruthless killer. In the Pacific Islands, it wiped out entire communities with terrifying efficiency. In Fiji in 1875, a single virus claimed 1/3 of the population. An infected ship, a tiny spark, ignited a holocaust in isolated worlds, reminding us how fragile and interconnected civilizations are. All these pandemics and others, the bubonic plague, the influenza pandemic, HIV/AIDS, didn't just wipe out populations. They changed the very fabric of history, shifting the balance of power, sparking revolutions, collapsing mighty civilizations, and forcing humanity to confront its vulnerabilities. They propelled science forward, driving innovations in quarantine, sanitation, vaccines, and antibiotics. The fight against microbes has been hard-fought and relentless. A war waged across centuries, transforming defeat into victory. And yet, as history demonstrates, microbes are forever at the gates, waiting. Humanity's greatest lesson: if disease has shaped the past, then knowledge and innovation will shape the future. The next chapter is our story of medical breakthroughs, pioneering minds, and the relentless human spirit fighting against invisible enemies to secure a safer tomorrow. By the mid-20th century, humanity stood at a turning point. For thousands of years, disease had dictated the fate of nations. But now, for the first time in history, we possessed the tools to fight back. Not with prayers, not with luck, but with science. The revolution began slowly, almost quietly. Vaccines had existed since Jenner's time, but mass vaccination, true population-wide protection, was still a distant dream. Most countries lacked infrastructure. Doctors struggled to reach remote villages. War, poverty, and political chaos created barriers everywhere. But after the devastation of World War II, the world realized something. If humanity could unite to rebuild nations, it could unite to fight disease. In 1948, something unprecedented happened. Nations across rival continents, allies, enemies, newly forming states, joined together to create a global health organization, the World Health Organization. Its mission was simple in words but enormous in scale: to protect life, anywhere on Earth, regardless of borders. And its greatest challenge stood before it: smallpox. For centuries, smallpox had ravaged humanity. It scarred faces, stole vision, destroyed families, and toppled kingdoms. Even in the mid-1900s, it still killed millions every year. Whole villages in Africa and Asia lived in fear of the next outbreak. Many believed it could never be defeated, but a handful of scientists, doctors, and field workers refused to accept that. They believed smallpox could be eradicated, not controlled, not reduced, but erased from human existence. The campaign began in 1967. Doctors traveled by jeep, boat, motorcycle, even on foot through jungles and deserts, carrying boxes of freeze-dried vaccine. They vaccinated entire villages in a single day. They drew maps of outbreaks by hand. They knocked on every door, checked every fever, traced every contact. One field medic later said, "We weren't just fighting a virus. We were fighting distance, fear, rumors, politics, and time." The world was divided by the Cold War, yet the United States and the Soviet Union cooperated in this mission. Soviet factories supplied millions of vaccine doses. American logistics systems transported them across continents. African and Asian health workers, often underpaid, often unrecognized, risked their lives to reach the most isolated populations. It was the greatest public health mobilization in human history. And then, in 1977, in a remote region of Somalia, the last known case of naturally occurring smallpox appeared. A young man named Ali Mao Malin. He survived. The virus did not. 3 years later, in 1980, the world declared smallpox eradicated. It was one of humanity's greatest victories, the first complete defeat of a major disease. And the revolution did not stop there. Polio became the next target. In the 1950s, cities all over the world were paralyzed by outbreak after outbreak. Children feared summer because summer meant polio season. Hospitals filled with iron lungs, towering metal machines that breathed for patients who no longer could. But Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin changed everything. One developed the first injectable vaccine. The other created the oral vaccine, sweet drops on a sugar cube that children could take without fear. Millions were immunized within years. By the start of the 21st century, polio was nearly gone. Once, it paralyzed hundreds of thousands each year. Now, fewer than a few dozen cases remain worldwide. Other victories followed: diphtheria, tetanus, measles, rubella. Diseases that shaped centuries of suffering were pushed back by syringes, cold chains, and global cooperation. Behind every breakthrough were countless unseen moments: health workers trekking through monsoon floods, vaccinators navigating war zones, scientists working through the night, parents carrying children to makeshift clinics under the open sky. The story of vaccines is not just a story of medicine, it is a story of determination, a belief that humanity can rewrite the fate biology once imposed on us. But with each victory, new challenges emerged. Viruses evolved, travel accelerated, information and misinformation spread faster than ever. And the next pandemics would demand not just vaccines, but global unity, trust, and preparation. Still, the achievements of the 20th century proved one thing beyond doubt: disease does not rule the world anymore. not as long as science, cooperation, and human courage stand together. And now, as this documentary moves toward its conclusion, the final chapter will explore the lessons we must carry forward and the choices that will determine our future in an age where invisible enemies still lurk, waiting for their chance to return. Pandemics have shaped human history for thousands of years, humbling empires, toppling armies, and rewriting the fate of nations. But if history teaches anything, it is this: every tragedy leaves behind a lesson, every outbreak carries a warning, every survival reveals a path forward. As the 21st century unfolds, humanity stands at a crossroads, armed with knowledge previous generations could hardly imagine, yet facing global challenges more complex and interconnected than ever. The first lesson is simple and urgent. Speed saves lives. From the Black Death to the Spanish flu to COVID-19, the pattern is clear. Those who act early endure less suffering. Delays turn outbreaks into disasters. Silence becomes as deadly as the disease itself. Today, global surveillance systems monitor unusual fevers and new variants in real time. Viruses race across continents, but data moves faster, enabling quicker, smarter responses. The second lesson: science is humanity's strongest defense. For millennia, we fought blind against invisible foes, but modern medicine, vaccines, antibiotics, genetic sequencing, molecular diagnostics has turned the tide of countless battles. Smallpox, once the deadliest of killers, was eradicated in 1980 through global cooperation. Polio is nearly defeated. HIV, once a death sentence, is now managed with life-saving antiretroviral therapy. These victories are no accident. They are the fruits of relentless research, boundless curiosity, and courage from scientists who refuse to surrender. The third lesson: disease is never just biological. It is deeply social. Fear spreads faster than infection. Misinformation can overwhelm hospitals as much as microbial threats. Pandemics expose societal inequities: who receives care, who is left vulnerable, who can work remotely, and who must risk everything to survive. History shows us that trust, transparency, and compassion are as vital as vaccines or medicine. Without these, societies fracture and microbes win. The fourth lesson: our world is more connected and more vulnerable than ever. A single traveler, one crowded market, one undetected case can spread a virus globally in hours. Urban density, climate change, deforestation, and global trade create fertile grounds for new zoonoses, diseases jumping from animals to humans. The next pandemic will not be a repeat. It will be unknown and unprecedented. The question is not if, but when. Yet amid these warnings lies profound hope. Humanity now wields tools that decades ago seemed like science fiction. Viruses can be sequenced in hours. Vaccines designed and deployed worldwide in mere months. Global surveillance networks map outbreaks in real time. Artificial intelligence predicts hotspots and viral mutations. Gene editing may one day neutralize entire virus families before they leap. We are no longer helpless. But the future depends not just on technology. It depends on choices. Will nations cooperate or compete? Will science be trusted or ignored? Will we heed history's lessons or repeat past mistakes? History's pandemics whisper their answers. They remind us strength lies in unity, that resilience grows from preparation, not denial, that humanity's greatest victories come when knowledge, compassion, and courage move together. So, as we step into a future filled with both promise and danger, we carry with us the long shadow of the Plague of Justinian, the terror of the Black Death, the devastation of smallpox, the tragedy of the Spanish flu, and the marvels of modern science. These stories are not merely history. They are guides, warnings, maps for tomorrow. Pandemics shaped our past. With wisdom, courage, and science, we have the power to shape our future.